This is Lecture 3 of Chapter 2, The Constitution, from American Government Roots and Reform, from PLS 211, U.S. Government 1, with Rappahannock Community College, and your instructor, Matt Brent. So now we're getting into the Constitution. We've had the meeting in Philadelphia, we've taken out the Articles of Confederation, and now we're starting to create the document that basically governs us today. When you look at the Constitution, the very first thing you see is the preamble. But surprisingly, they actually wrote that part last. The words "we the people" decide in whom sovereignty was vested. It came from the people, not the states, not the federal government, but the people. The Constitution was signed by most of those remaining at the convention, and then it was sent to the states for ratification. Here on the screen you have the preamble of the United States Constitution. It states, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." That little portion of the Constitution is going to create a whole bunch of interpretations. If you take PLS 212, U.S. Government 2, it deals primarily with public policy, and a lot of that is drawn from the preamble. Well, within the Constitution, there's a variety of information. But before we get to the different articles, let's chat a little bit about the basic principles found in the Constitution. The first of which is federalism. A unitary government was basically unacceptable due to the colonist experience with the British. And the idea of a confederation had actually failed under the Articles of Confederation, so the Founding Fathers created a halfway house, which they called federalism. Under federalism, power is divided among the states and the national government. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter, Chapter 3. Separation of powers is the second principle. The framers were afraid of government which was too powerful, so they wanted to limit it. They didn't want to put too much power into one set of hands, so to speak, so they divided the power up vertically through federalism and horizontally through the separation of powers among the three branches of government. Each branch would be independent yet equal with different staffs and functions. Related to separation of powers is the concept of checks and balances. Each branch of government is either checked or limited and balanced by the powers held by the other branches of government. This is set up in such a way that no one can really tyrannize the other branches or the people. Now, these are the three principles of the Constitution as described by Larry Sabato and Karen O'Connor in their textbook. Other political scientists will add some or take some away. So you might also encounter things like individual liberties, popular sovereignty, and more. Sometimes they even consider judicial review. So it just depends on the political scientist you're reading about. But for the purposes of this textbook, they outline these three: federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances. What you're seeing on the screen now is a diagram from your text, which basically outlines the separation of powers and the checks and balances. You guys can see that there are three branches of government: the legislative branch in the red there, executive branch in blue, and the judicial branch in yellow. This is a really good chart because it actually shows not only what the branch's powers are, but how they interact or can interact with the other branches of government. A lot of times my students just assume this always happens all the time, and that's not exactly the case. For example, if you look where it says executive checks on the legislature, the first one is veto legislation. That doesn't mean the president is constantly vetoing things. The president has the option of vetoing legislation, but it doesn't mean every bill that comes through he has to veto. So that's important to understand. Similarly, under the judicial checks on the executive, declare executive branch actions unconstitutional. Same thing with judicial checks on the legislative. Rule federal and state laws unconstitutional. The court's not always doing that, but again, it has the option. So these are checks and balances which the different branches have the option of using. They're put in place to ensure that neither branch basically steps out of line with the Constitution. So now that we've gone through the preamble and we've looked a little bit about the principles, let's actually look at the meat of the Constitution, specifically the articles of the Constitution. The first of which is Article 1, the legislative branch. If you think about the Articles of Confederation, all they had was a legislative branch. So it's nice that they carried that over to the Constitution, but it's by far the only branch, and that's important to remember. So the legislative branch is established by Article 1, as it's displayed up there on the screen, and the Congress consists of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. That goes back to the Connecticut Compromise, establishing the two houses, the bicameral Congress, and allowing one to be based on representation by population and the other based on equality. So in Congress, you can be a member, but you have to meet certain requirements for office as outlined in the Constitution, which not only does that, it also determines the methods of how congressmen are selected, how long they can serve in office, and the various operating procedures of the different houses. Article 1, Section 8 enumerates the powers of Congress. Basically what that means is it lists them. The enumerated powers include things like the right to tax, regulate commerce, coin money, and so on. However, Congress also has implied powers. What that means is that the powers are not specifically listed in the Constitution, but we derive the power from the wording of the Constitution, most notably in something called the Elastic Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause. Those two things are the same. Different textbooks and different people use the different terms, but they're the same thing. Basically, what this is a clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8, which says that Congress shall, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, end quote. And this has been interpreted as a broad grant of powers over the years. And as we go through this course and we talk about various court cases, we'll look at how the courts interpret that to either restrict the implied powers or expand the implied powers. The second article is Article 2, which deals with the executive branch. That establishes the executive branch and places at the head of it a president. Section 1 of Article 2 sets the president's term of office and explains the Electoral College. It also states the qualifications to hold such office and the mechanism to replace or remove the president. The powers and the duties of the presidency are set out in Section 3, and that includes his role as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and the authority to make treaties with the consent of the Senate. In other passages, the president is told to report to Congress, quote, from time to time, end quote. And that has basically become the annual State of the Union address, which you can usually watch on TV in the month of January. Article 3 establishes the judicial branch. Congress was authorized to set up, quote, such inferior courts as they are deemed necessary, end quote. But that particular article doesn't exactly outline the federal judiciary beyond the Supreme Court. Article 3 establishes the Supreme Court, but it doesn't specify the number of judges or their qualifications. It also lays out the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. Federal judges serve terms on good behavior, or basically for life. As long as they do what they're supposed to do, they can keep serving as a justice or a judge. This allows the judicial branch some independence from political motives that may be floating around. Article 3 also forbids Congress from lowering judicial salaries while a judge is holding office. The most important power of the Supreme Court is not even mentioned in the Constitution, and that's the power of judicial review. Judicial review is the power of a court to determine whether a law or a regulation or some kind of government action is actually constitutional. They took this power in a clever decision written by Chief Justice John Marshall in the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when it comes to the chapter on the judicial branch. Article 4 through 7 are kind of a hodgepodge of different things. If you look at Articles 1, 2, and 3, they kind of all deal with laws. Article 1, the legislative branch, deals with a group that makes the laws. Article 2, the executive branch, deals with the group that enforces the laws. And Article 3, the judicial branch, deals with the branch that interprets the laws. So let's look at Articles 4 through 7 really quick. Article 4 begins with something we refer to as the full faith and credit clause. And basically what this does is it mandates that the states honor the laws and proceedings of another state. For example, if I were to get my windows tinted in Nevada and it's legal there, then I move to Michigan where such a thing is illegal, I can't be prosecuted. It also means that a state must recognize each other's marriages and divorce laws. And that's something that's become quite controversial due to various states legalizing things like same-sex marriage. For example, my wife and I actually got married in the state of Delaware, where she's from, and now here we are living in Virginia. So Virginia recognizes our marriage. However, Delaware recently enacted same-sex marriage laws. So if I were to go to Delaware and marry someone of the same sex and move to Virginia, theoretically, the state of Virginia should recognize that based on the full faith and credit clause. And there's some issues with that right now, so it's not exactly clear. And I personally wouldn't be surprised if there are some court cases popping up in the near future to handle things like that. Article 4 also says that federal law is supreme, and that's important. The federal law is supreme over state law. So if the states and the federal government argue, the federal government wins, hands down. And this was designed to avoid many of the excesses under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles also include rules on the admission of new states to the Union, detailing how amendments can be added to the Constitution. They prohibit religious tests for holding office and set out procedures for the ratification of the document itself, which actually at this point had already happened based on the different people supporting it, which we're going to get to right now.